and we'll shorten a little bit this week. We'll put together from both Shabbos in a little bit. Last Shabbos, which was actually the day before Tisha B'Av, Erev Tisha B'Av in the afternoon, the Rebbe began the Farbrengen based on a halacha that Erev Tisha B'Av, when it falls out to be on Shabbos, in public, b'frahesya, one is not allowed to do anything which is a sign of Avelis. In other words, one is not allowed to change a minhag, which is accustomed to feel sich this way, on every Shabbos, and act differently on the Shabbos of Erev Tisha B'Av because that it is Erev Tisha B'Av. In other words, if one does so, it's considered that he's doing an Avelis, an act of Avelis, and he's doing it b'frahesya, which is something which is prohibited to do on Shabbos. In fact, the Rebbe says, this is one of the reasons that led him to Farbrengen last Shabbos. Because he says he has been Farbrengen for many, many Shabbosim. And he wouldn't Farbrengen this Shabbos, so it would be obvious that the reason he's not Farbrengen on this Shabbos is because of Tisha B'Av. Memela, Rebbe says he feels it would be the proper thing to Farbrengen on the Shabbos, which falls out to be Erev Tisha B'Av. However, as far as what to discuss on this Shabbos, the Rebbe says the Magen Avram paskens, and the Magen Avram, it is written by the Devarim Va'eschanan, who was a grandson and one of the biggest chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe, when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, relied a lot on the Magen Avram. So the Magen Avram paskens, the Rebbe says, that on Shabbos, Erev Tisha B'Av, in the afternoon, we're only allowed to learn these inyanim that have a shaychus to Tisha B'Av. In other words, inyanim which we're allowed to learn on Tisha B'Av, or on an ordinary Erev Tisha B'Av in the afternoon, the same thing applies to Shabbos. Memela, the Rebbe says the inyanim he's going to talk about are all inyanim that are mutter to learn on this day, on the day of Erev Tisha B'Av, even it is Shabbos, based on the psak of the Magen Avram. And the Rebbe went on to explain, on one hand we see that the general idea of Tisha B'Av, the Churban, is a tremendous yerida for Klal Yisrael. It's a letdown. The Rebbe destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, took away something which is extremely precious to us. It's a tremendous inyan of yerida. However, we know, see, the stress is always that how low the yerida is, the aliyah, the uplifting that comes as a result of this yerida, always has to be in accordance to the yerida. Memela, if the yerida is extremely big, so we must say that the uplifting, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to give us a tremendous aliyah as a result of the churban, is also a tremendous one. And the Rebbe says it's remarkable. We find that on the day of Tisha B'Av, we say in davening, in Shmona Esrei, the mincha of Tisha B'Av, we say Nachim. What is the taich of Nachim? Nachim means it's an expression of condolence. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is it's a feeling of condolence on the Churban HaBayis. On one hand, it's the day of Tisha B'Av, and not only in the morning, but in the afternoon. And the Gemara tells us that the fire of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was bigger in the afternoon than in the morning. So it was the extreme time of Yerida on one hand. And on the other hand, we say that in this extreme time of Yerida, the Chachamim found it appropriate that Yidden should say a tefillah of Nachem, which expresses a feeling of Nechama on the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash. The Rebbe went on that the Gemara tells us, Medrash tells us, that in the moment of destruction, when the Rebbe destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, that is when Mashiach Shel Yisrael was born. Mashiach, in the first Gilgul, first time when, in other words, Ilu Zoch, if Yidden would have been Zaycheh, there was a Mashiach born right away at the moment when the Rebbe destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. What does this show? This shows us that being that it's a Yerida Tzorech Aliyah, every Yerida, every going down, is because later there is an uplifting following it. Memela, based on that, automatically, as soon as the Rebbe destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, he left room right away for tremendous aliyah, for tremendous, uplifting. And that is why the Rebbe continues. The Gemara says, "Lo hoyu yomim tovim liyisrael ki chamisha asa ba'av u'chu yom kippurim." Mother says that the greatest yontif Yidden ever had was the 15th of Av, which is today's day. We will get to it a little bit later. The Rebbe spoke about it today as well. And Yom Kippur. The emes is that Yomim Tovim that should fall out on the 15th of the month is not only Chamishas Av. Pesach and Sukkot, which are very famous Yomim Tovim, are also each one the 15th of its proper month. Sukkot is the 15th of Tishrei, as well Pesach the 15th of Nisan. Still, when the Gemara wants to express a greatness of a Yontiv, and the Gemara wants to say Lo hoyu Yomim Tovim liYisrael, that the Yidden didn't have no Yontiv that can compare to the greatness of Chamishasa B'Av. Why is this? Because after the tremendous Yerida which Yidden had, which was the cause of the Churban Beis Hamikdash, which is Tisha B'Av, comes right away. A couple days later, HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates an inyan, which is an aliyah, which is a tremendous uplifting for Yidden, which is the Yontef of Chamishas B'Av. The Rebbe went on last week, the Rebbe Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who is known as a tremendous Meilitz Yosher. He always finds good on Yidden. The Rebbe brought a taich from him, a taich which is said in the Haftarah of Parshas Chazayin. There's a pasuk in Chazayin Yeshayahu. There's a pasuk Am Keved Ovain, simply meaning Am a nation, Keved Ovain, which is very heavy with averas. That's the pasuk taich of the pasuk. Rebbe Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. And here the Rebbe says, in his taich, we see his attitude to Yidden. He taiches completely different. He taiches Am. Am means, Chassidus always brings this taich. Am means, besides meaning a nation, it also means when a fire is very low. Gacholim oimemois. Chassidus taiches brings this expression very often. That's also has a shaykhus to the word of Am. So Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev taiches, even when Yidden are in a position of Am, meaning the fire in them, the warmth in them to the Eibishter is at a very low level, just like an outgoing fire, not a fire that's spreading. On the contrary, it's an Am. Even when they're in the position of Am, it's also Keved Ovain. It's hard for them to do Averis. So he takes the pasuk, turns it around, and taiches, finds in it the greatness of Yidden. So Mele, this same Rebbe Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev also finds it appropriate to taich. How does he taich Shabbos Chazayin? The world taiches Shabbos Chazayin based on the pasuk of Chazayin Yeshayahu. That's the Haftarah we said last Shabbos. It begins with the words Chazayin Yeshayahu. Chazayin means vision. Rebbe Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev taiches, this is a proper Shabbos when Yidden can have a view, can grasp a look on the third Beis Hamikdash. That's how he taiches Chazayin. In other words, this comes as a preparation for the coming of Mashiach. In other words, it's another uplifting for Yidden, all being that the Rebbe gave us a tremendous Yerida. So as a result of this Yerida, the Aliyah has to also be a very big one. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to uplift us very, very high. Memela, this Shabbos is another step on the pedestal. This is a step where we're getting closer to seeing the third Beis Hamikdash. That's how he taiches Shabbos Chazayin. And Rabbi added on, Rabbi Yitzchak of Berdichev.
Yeah, he taiches the uncovered over the whole pasuk taiches down.
Get in. And based on the, I don't recall. In the Farbrengen, I think the Rabbi only taiches the uncovered ovain and tied it in with his taiching Shabbos Chazayin. And the Rabbi added on with a mashal that a father once gave a very dear thing to his child, something which was extremely dear to the child. However, the child didn't behave properly, so he took it away from him. Then the child begged for it very strongly, so the father gave it to him again. However, the child again couldn't resist to behave properly, so the child lost it again. Then the father wanted to bring the child back to proper attitude, so he takes this thing which is extremely dear to the child and shows it to him and tells him, when you act properly, you will again be rewarded with this thing. The very same is with this idea of Shabbos Chazayin and the Beis Hamikdash, that the Rebbe is showing us the Beis Hamikdash. This is not, in other words, this is a Shabbos where Yidden can lift himself up to a level of looking up to, getting a view into the third Beis Hamikdash in a spiritual sense. and by this, the Rebbe is bringing us closer to really giving us the third Beis Hamikdash, which should be in the near future. Then the Rebbe went on and he said, we find something very interesting. We find the Chazal, the Gemara says that when the Rebishter really destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, the Kvius in that year was the very same as it was this year. Tisha B'Av was on a Motzei Shabbos, on a Saturday night. And the Chazal also add on, not only was it Motzei Shabbos, it was also Mitzoi Shavias. It was in a year which came after the Shemitah year, which is, again, like our year. The year we are in now is a year of Hakel, and the year of Hakel always comes following a year of Shemitah. So Mamela, the Rebbe says, being that the Kviyas this year is the same as the Kviyas was when the Rebishter really brought the Churban on Yidden, so this is a proper year to really be rewarded by the Rebishter, that just like then it was on a Matzoi Shavias and a Matzoi Shabbos, the same way we should be rewarded by HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the near future, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should really give us back the Beis HaMikdash. Then the Rebbe went on saying a Maimah last week, and he said he will say a Maimah which was said by the Rebbe Rashab in a year when Tisha B'Av came out the same way as this year. And this goes back to the year of Tov Reish Ayin Daled, 1914. The Rebbe said that the Rebbe Rashab said his Maimah on Friday night. However, then it was a custom that for Chazarah, Hasidim would go back into the Rebbe. It means that just like today there is a Chazar, somebody who repeats and records whatever the Rebbe says. So then it was like a group of Bachurim that was a custom then that would go back into the Rebbe Nishma Seiden's room, repeat the Maimah for him, and he would listen, and they would make sure if they understood the Maimah properly. This is how it was accustomed by the Rebbe Rashab. Rebbe related that by that particular year, they went into the Rebbe Rashab on Shabbos Chazoin, Shabbos afternoon, or Shabbos Mincha time, and they began to Chazar the Maimah, and it got involved in the Maimah that it extended into the night, into Tisha B'Av. The Rebbe added on, though only the beginning and the end of the Maimah, the beginning of the Maimah was on the Pasuk Tzir B'Mishpat Tepada, so it deals with the Inyan, with the Inyanim of Churban, as well as the end of the Maimah. However, the contents of the Maimah in itself is an Inyan in Chassidus, which has nothing to do with the Churban. And the Rebbe last week Shabbos also repeated this Maimah, which the Rebbe Rashab said in Shabbos Chazoin, Tov Reish Ayin Daled. Then later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe went on explaining a Rashi, and he also said he will explain a Rashi in last week's Sedra, which has a shaykhis to the Inyan of Meraglim. The Meraglim. Mother tells us that when the Meraglim came back with the report on Eretz Yisrael, all of Klal Yisrael in the Midbar wept. They began crying. The Rebishter said that this is a cry which there's no need for this cry. Memela, the Rebishter at that time already punished them that a time will come when they will have to cry. And when will this be? By the time of the Churban. So we see that the Inyan of Meraglim has a shaykhus to the Inyan of Churban. So that's what the Rebbe said. If we're looking for an appropriate Rashi to learn in Erev Tisha B'Av afternoon, it can be an Inyan which deals with Meraglim. As well, when it came to Taichos, the Mishnah and others, the Rebbe also Taichos a Mishnah and others, which quotes a pasuk in Eicha. Mishnah tells us the greatness of 10 people that learn Torah, greatness of even a fewer amount that learn Torah. Then the Mishnah tells us in third Perek of Avos, even when one person sits and learns Torah, it's also very great. What's the Raya? Mishnah quotes a pasuk, Shenema Yeshev Badot V'Yidoi. It's a pasuk in Eicha. So Rebbe says a Mishnah that quotes a pasuk in Eicha deals with a pasuk in Eicha, so naturally we're allowed to learn it to Shabbos afternoon, which is the Erev Tisha B'Av. As well, when it came to learn an Inyan in Beis HaBchira, the Rebbe found also a suitable Inyan. In Rambam, the Rambam tells us that when Shlomo constructed the pious structure of the Beis HaMikdash, he left Shlomo knew that a time will come when the Beis HaMikdash will be destroyed. And Mela, he created an area where the Aron should be hid into. Mela, the Rebbe says this is a halacha in Rambam which also deals with Churban HaBayis. So the Rebbe learned Ba'arichus Pshat from that halacha of the Rambam. As well, when he spoke an Indian in the Zayar, he also, it was an Indian in Zayar, which also had a shaykhs to the Indian of Chum. Then the Rebbe spoke last week, also extremely strong. The Rebbe says he hasn't spoken about it a while, and he spoke again very, very strong, as we know the Rebbe's opinion against family planning. He spoke about it extremely strong again, and he says this is also an Indian which has to do with the coming of Mashiach. Why? Because we all know the Gemara tells us that Ein ben David ba at sheyichla neshama shebeguf. That the coming of Mashiach is dependent until all the neshamas will come out of the oitza. The oitza ha-neshamas, the source of neshamas, is called guf. That's the pshat in the Gemara. Gemara says, Ein ben David ba at sheyichla neshama shebeguf. Meil the Rebbe says that by the birth of each and every child, it causes and brings closer the coming of Mashiach. And Mamela, we shouldn't feel that to go out and talk to other people about these inyanim and to influence other people about these inyanim is something which isn't appropriate, or we may not even have influence on other people or something like it. The Rebbe says, who are we to evaluate the greatness of a neshama? Mamela, when we go out and talk to another yid, we cannot make a decision, we're not going to talk to this yid about such an inyan, because it's not going to help anyways. So the Rebbe referred to the famous Maaseh of the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab had a chassid who was a big diamond merchant. And he was extremely close to the Rebbe. He was in a very close relation with the Rebbe. And this chassid had a custom that before and after every major trip, he would come to Lubavitch to the Rebbe. He was on his way back from one of his most successful business trips, and he comes to the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe Rashab asks him, "No, how did you make out on this trip?" He says, "Rebbe, this was a fantastic trip. I bought such a stone, which is so precious, it's fantastic." So the Rebbe Rashab tells him, "Show me." Excuse me, I missed out part of the story. In the early part of their conversation, they were talking about a particular Jew that lived in the city where this merchant lived. And the Rebbe Rashab was talking very much in favor and praising this Jew. And this chassid couldn't understand, and he told the Rebbe, he was very free to the Rebbe, and he told the Rebbe, I don't understand what you see something special in this Jew, why are you praising him so? Okay. Now let us go back. He is so proud of his business trip, and he's showing the jewel, the most very nice stone. He's showing the Rebbe Rashab the stone. And the Rebbe Rashab walks over with him to the window, and they get a good look on the stone. And the Rebbe Rashab says, I'm sorry to tell you, I see nothing special on this stone. So he says, Rebbe, mit darf sein a maven. When it's supposed to be a maven to really be able to understand on the stone and the diamond. So the Rebbe says, the same implies when we're talking about a yid. When we're talking about a yid and referred back to the conversation they had a short while ago, one is supposed to be a maven to really understand and realize the greatness of a neshama. The Rebbe Rashab criticized him. You were telling me before that this individual person who we were talking about, he's not that outstanding, there's nothing so special in him. The Rebbe said, if I yidden dach me sein am maven. So the Rebbe said the same thing applies today as well. Nobody really can understand and really evaluate the greatness of a neshama. And based on that, the Rebbe continued, we can never know if we're going to have influence on a yid. And we are supposed to look with a right eye that definitely we will have influence on yid. And this is something which we shouldn't even feel bashful about. We shouldn't feel shy about approaching people about these inyanim. And when we feel that it's an appropriate time to talk to Yidden about this inyan and clarify it to them, we shouldn't come up with excuses. And amaslas, an excuse in Hebrew, there's a word amasla. It's an Aramic word. The Rebbe always teaches amasla is composed of two words. Real meaning of it is an excuse. However, it's composed of two words, emes loy. It's not the truth. If we want to create an excuse, it's an emes loy. It's something which we want to talk ourselves into, that we have other things to talk about, or stay away from this issue. It may not be tzniistic, it may not be proper to talk about this. The Rebbe says, but this is completely not so. This is something which simply the coming of Mashiach and the entire Geulah, which affects each and every Yid, all the way back till our Ovis and the Imois, till Avraham, Yitzchak, V'Yankiv, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, V'Leah, is all dependent on each and every Jewish child that is born. Now we will go in a little bit to today's Farbrengen. The Rebbe began today's Farbrengen that this Shabbos is called Shabbos Nachamu. And as we say in the Haftorah begins Nachamu, Nachamu, a double expression of Nechama. Nechama b'kiflayim. It's double Nechama. Why? Being that we find the expression Bochei Sifke, that the tears which the Yidden shed on the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash is also a double expression. Bochei Sifke. As well we find Chet Chota, sin they sinned, also doubly. So when it comes HaKadosh Baruch Hu is coming to express his condolence to Yidden, he also expresses it in a strong way, Nachamu, Nachamu, in a double way. The Rebbe says this has an effect even in Halacha. There's a klal by Kodshim, by Korbanis, Shana Olav HaKosuv La'akev. What does this mean? If the Torah tells us, in the details where the Torah tells us, how we're supposed to bring a korban, so over there, if it's mentioned in the Torah once, it means that if it wasn't done so, this is the way it should be done. However, if it wasn't done this way, b'di evet, it is also good. However, shana olav hakosov, when the Torah tells it twice, la'akev, then it's ma'akev. It keeps us, it holds back. It means that if this is not done, then the korban was not brought properly. Memela, we find that when something is repeated twice, it's because it's supposed to have an extra strong impact. The very same here, when we find HaKadosh Baruch Hu was expressing himself doubly, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, it comes to show that the Rebbe is showing a tremendous feeling of condolence to Yidden. Nachamu, Nachamu. As well, the Rebbe says we also find an expression when the Rebbe calls in the Torah, when the Rebbe refers to Avraham Avinu, he says Avraham, Avraham. So Rashi comments, based on Chazal, what's the Kefil Lashon? Why is it a double expression? A double expression comes to show an expression of love, an expression of chibah. Memela, when the Rebbe tells Yidden, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, it's also an expression of love and warmth which the Rebbe is expressing to Yidden. As well, the Rebbe went on, it's also a double Nechama for both Beis HaMikdash, for the first Beis HaMikdash as well as for the second Beis HaMikdash. Even though the Rebbe added on, this pasuk was said by Yeshaya Hanavi, and Yeshaya Hanavi said it after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. So how could we say that it also implies on the second Beis HaMikdash? The Rebbe added on that when Yeshaya said it at a stage where he hoped that there will never be a Churban again. However, being that unfortunately there was a second Beis HaMikdash which was also destroyed, so the same words of Yeshaya, of Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, also apply not only to the first Beis HaMikdash, but as well to the second Beis HaMikdash. The Rebbe added on today, there's a klal in Choshen Mishpat in Halacha, that a shtar sheyotza olav iro, I'll explain it in a minute, has much more validity. A shtar means a document, a note. A shtar sheyotza olav iro means if a rumor came out that this specific shtar, this specific document or note or transaction is no good. It's false, it's a false document. Later it was proven that it is a good document. So the Gemara tells al pi halacha, this shtar, which yotza olav iro, in other words, which there was a rumor on it that this shtar is no good, once it was clarified that it is a good shtar, then it is a super good shtar. Then it is better than an ordinary shtar. Then it carries real special weight, then it's a real effective document. Why? Because it withstood this rumor that it's false or it's not proper, and it was proven proper, so this shtar, this document is is a very extremely strong document. This is so benegay the financial dinim that are involved with this document. The same Rebbe applies When the Shtashe Yotza Olav Irul, meaning that on the Beis HaMikdash there was an inyan of Irul. The Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Irul means argument. It was proven false, proven no good. And once we have overcame that, and will accept that the Nechama, the condolence from the Rebishter will give us the third Beis HaMikdash. This third Beis HaMikdash will be something by far much stronger than the Batei Mikdash which we had till Memela. This, the Rebbe goes on, this shows that Shabbos Nachmu in general is an appropriate time to do inyanim that have a shaykhs that will bring back the Beis HaMikdash. That all our actions, particularly on Shabbos Nachmu, call for tshuva, which these are inyanim which will bring back the third Beis HaMikdash. How much more so is it when Shabbos Nachmu comes out, like today, on the 15th of Av? 15th of Av, we know we discussed before as the Rebbe spoke last week, that the Yidden didn't have no Yontiv which is as great as Chamishasa B'Av and Yom Kippur. That's what the Gemara says. So we see that the Gemara, we know Yom Kippur is an extremely holy day. Yom Kippurim. We know the Chazal tell us that Purim and Yom Kippur are similar. Why? Because there is a goyrel, there is a lot which is involved. Purim as well as Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, we know that there was the goyrel in the Beis HaMikdash as far as the korbanos with the soil la'azazel. So that involved a goyrel. Purim, we know there was also the goyrel, the famous goyrel of Haman. Haman Hippel Pur, who had goyrel, and he chose, and it came out that he came out with the decree on Yidden for the month of Adar. So we find a similarity, something very similar between Purim and Yom Kippur. The Rebbe said we shouldn't look down on the idea of goyrel and say that it's something which isn't important, it's not extremely chashiv. So the Rebbe says that there's a tshuvas hagoynim, which the goynim write. The Goinim is before the Rishonim yet. After the Amoraim was a period which is called Goinim. The Goinim write, whoever does not believe in the truth of a Goyrel, it's considered like he does not believe in Aseres HaDivros. That's how much power is given to a Goyrel, especially when a Goyrel is made al Pi Hashem. Like the Inyanim, we're talking about Goyrel in Kedusha. We're talking about the Goyrel which is made on Yom Kippur, the Goyrel which has to do on Purim. So we see Yom Kippur, it led to a nest. The whole Arichas from the Rebbe about it. The whole Sikha from the Rebbe about it. So on Yom Kippur, it's a tremendous day when we're not allowed to eat. In other words, we reach high madregas. However, we have to stay away from Gashmis. If Purim is similar to Yom Kippur, the Rebbe teaches, it means that Purim we can achieve the same thing, but in a different way. On the contrary, through simcha, through rejoicing and eating and drinking, this is part of the celebration of Purim, we accomplish Purim the same thing which we can accomplish in Kippur. And here we see that the Gemara tells us that today's day, the 15th of Av, is just as Yom Kippur. So we see that the date of the 15th of Av, which has expression goes, this is a day when the moon is complete. In its completion, it's the 15th of the month. And we know that Yisrael Moin and Levana. So this is a day of tremendous importance. In other words, this day also adds on to the idea of Nechama. Why? Because this is a day, as discussed earlier, as discussed previously, this is something, we know that there are other Yomim Tovim which also fall out on the 15th of given months. However, this day of Chamishas B'Av, this is something which comes after Yom Kippur, after Tisha B'Av, and this is what the Gemara refers to, that this is the greatest Yom Tov which the Yidden ever had. Why? Because this is the uplifting which Yidden get after the Yerida, the tremendous Yerida of Tisha B'Av. The idea of the Yom Tov of Chamishas B'Av, as it's described in Gemara, as well as Purim, all show the idea of unity, the idea of Achdus. Churban Habayis came as a result because there was no Achdus by Yidden. There was a lack of Hakel. However, these mitzvahs show the idea of Hakel. The Rebbe said he was asked, there was a question raised, Why is it that he keeps on referring to the entire year as a Shnas Hakel? He says Hakel is something which took place Sukkot after the first Sukkot after Shemitah. So that on Sukkot, Yidden fulfilled the mitzvah of Hakel. However, why do we refer to the entire year as a Shnas Hakel? Hakel has nothing to do with the remainder of the year. And still the Rebbe has, and we see the Rebbe in the Sichos that at every occasion keeps on stressing that this is a year of Hakel. Rebbe added on, we find the same thing by Yovel. Yovel is the 50th year. After 7 Shemitahs comes Yovel. So we see that the entire year is called Shnas HaYovel. Yovel is the blowing of the shofar. The blowing of the shofar took place when? On Yom Kippur. And the Rebbe said there are other things which Yovel introduces. Yovel sends home all the avodim, and there are many dinim which apply to Yovel. However, the year is called not by the term of Shnas Chayvos. The year is not called by any other title. The entire year is called Shnas HaYovel. Remember, though we see that Yovel is only done on Yom Kippur, it gives this title to the entire year. The same thing, Shnas Hakel. Hakel is done only in the beginning of the year of Sukkot, but the entire year is referred to as Shnas Hakel. So the Rebbe asked, if so, we spoke last week, which we just discussed a few minutes ago. The Chazal tell us that when did the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash take place? It took place Motzoi Shavias, the year following Shemitah. Why do the Chazal use the expression the year following Shemitah, yet let them use the expression the year of Hakel? So Rebbe says no. There it's not appropriate for Chazal to use this expression, because the idea of Churban Beis HaMikdash was something which is contrary to the idea of Hakel. Hakel shows that all of Yidden unite together. All of Yidden are standing together, men, women, and children, and even infants. However, the idea of Churban Beis HaMikdash came because there was a sinas chinam, there was a hatred without any reason between one Yidden and another. Memela, if so, it's not appropriate that the Chazal there should use the expression, when was the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, in a Shnas Hakel. It wouldn't be a proper expression. That's why the Chazal there have to use the expression that when was the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, b'motzoi Shavios. When it came to learn today the Mishnah in Avos, Rabbi said the question is which Mishnah to learn, which Perek to learn. Why? Because there are many that feel sich that last week they didn't learn Pirkei Avos. Last week should have been the third Perek. Today, if we would say last week the third Perek, today would be the fourth Perek. But what do we do with those that didn't learn last week Perek? Rabbi says for those that didn't learn last week Perek, it would be proper today to say again something in the third Perek, some Amonishach. Rabbi says those that learned last week will learn again this week. So we explained one Mishnah last week, and we'll explain another Mishnah this week. For those that didn't learn last week, why should they lose out an interpretation on a Perek? So the Rebbe chose today to say Pshat in the third Perek of Avos in a Mishnah. To understand a little better, I think if we look into Sidurim, we'll get a better understanding of the Mishnah. The Rebbe learned Mishnah Daled and a part of Mishnah Zayin. Actually, what the Rebbe really stressed was Mishnah Zayin. The fourth Mishnah begins, Rab Chanina ben Chachinoi Oimer. Rab Chanina ben Chachinoi says, Haneir Belayla, if one is up late at night, V'hamahalach b'derech yichidi, and he goes on the road himself. In those days, going on roads oneself would be something very dangerous. V'hamefane libay levatola, and he just wastes his time. Hareze mischayev b'nafshe. This person is endangering his life. In other words, he's acting He's doing maisim, he's doing actions which lead him to sakon. He's acting not proper. Let us go to the latter part of Mishnah Zayin. In the middle of the Mishnah, it begins Rabbi Yankif Oimer. Hamahalach b'derech. If one travels, v'sheina, and he's learning. He's traveling and he's learning. U'mafsik mimishnasik. And in the middle of learning, he's mafsik. V'oimer, and he says, Manoa ilan zeh. How nice is this tree? He's admiring a tree which HaKadosh Baruch Hu was created. How beautiful is this tree? Manoa nir zeh. How beautiful is this plowed field? Mala olav hakosuf. The pasuk considers keilu mischayev benafshoy, as if he was guilty, in other words, of doing something which he deserves an einish of mis. So the Rebbe asked several questions in the Mishnah. Firstly, the Rebbe says, what's happening here? The Forshim comment that this pshat is that this person is walking on the road and he's learning. However, he sees the beauty which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created. So we know that when one sees beauty which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created, he's mechuyev to make a bracha. Baruch shekach aloi ba'olamai. So the pshat is he's mafsik to make this bracha. So if he's mafsik to make this bracha, what kind of crime is this person doing? We say he's doing such a crime that he's endangering himself. He's mischayev b'nafshe. He's doing something which he's worthwhile of. The opposite of life, chas v'shalom. He's mischayev b'nafshe. What is he doing so wrong? And the Rebbe says this question, he says, is already asked. We say mala olav hakosiv. The pasuk considers as if he'd be doing something extremely wrong. Which pasuk? Where's the source of the pasuk that tells us that he's doing something wrong? Which pasuk is it? Let Mishnah tell us which is the pasuk. Mishnah doesn't say that. The pasuk considers. Which pasuk? Based on what pasuk is he doing something wrong? Rebbe says there are other girses which instead of Rabbi Yankif have it Reb Shimon or Reb Shimon says. Rebbe says it would be very appropriate for Reb Shimon to say it. Why? Because Tam Reb Shimon is Reb Shimon ben Yechoy, and we know Reb Shimon ben Yechoy was Terasoi and Nasoi. He was extremely involved in learning, and he demanded learning. So it would be appropriate for Reb Shimon ben Yechoy to say that if a person even goes out to admire the beauty that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, but being that he's interrupting his learning, it's an avra. But for Rabbi Yankif to say that, Rabbi Yankif, Rabbi says, was a colleague of Reb Shimon. We are told that they both traveled together to learn by Rabbi Akiva, but still, Reb Shimon is known for his outstandingness, being extremely outstanding as far as Torah Seyim Nasir. But again, we see that the Alter Rebbe did not accept the girs of Reb Shimon. The Alter Rebbe accepted the girs of Rabbi Yankif. The Rebbe also pointed out differences between Mishnah Dalet to this Mishnah. In Mishnah Dalet, the Mishnah says, "Hamahalach baderech yichidi." He's going on the road himself. Here, not necessarily he's going himself. He's a mahalach baderech, a geitem weg. He's going. As well as other differences. Mishnah Dalet says, "Hareze mischayev benafshoy." Mishnah Zayin says, "Hareze keilu mischayev benafshoy," as if he's doing something which he's guilty of a penalty, of a death penalty. In other words, the expression in Mishnah Zayin is a much more lenient one as a Mishnah Dalet. The Rebbe says there is a taich from the Baal Shem, which is quoted from the Baal Shem Tov and from the Maggid on this Mishnah. But they have it different. They, in the saying of Rabbi Yankif, they also add on the word Hamahalech baderech yichidi. One goes alone in the way. He's alone on the road, he's traveling and he's learning. Obviously, the Rebbe says it seems like the Alter Rebbe did not accept this version that he's traveling himself as far as the saying of Rabbi Yankif. But the Rebbe said over the taich of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, which is a very geschmack taich in itself. Shem Tov taiched, Hamahalech baderech, if one he's going on the path, he's going on the road. What means he's going on the road? He's going on the right road, on the right path, which a person is supposed to go on. Yechidi. But he thinks about himself that he's a one and only. He's a real special. That's how this person begins to evaluate himself. He is going on the right path, and he's somebody very, very special. V'shoina, and he's learning. How could be somebody better than him? He's in the right derech, and he's learning. Mafsik memishnasei, and he takes a pause in the middle of his learning, and he begins to evaluate himself. Va'omer, and he says, "Ma'no ilon zeh, ki adam eitz hasada." Man is compared to an ilon, to a tree. He says on himself, how nice and outstanding is he. Ma'no nir zeh, how beautiful is this plowed field. In other words, he's thinking about himself. He's a person. He's walking on the way. He's learning. He's going on the right path. He's really something special. This is how one person thinks about himself. So the Mishnah tells us, if a person thinks so about himself, Malol of Akosuf, the Pasuk considers this person Ke'ilu Mischayev Benafshe. I mean, this is a person who's completely not appreciated with such type of an attitude. He's acting as if Mischayev Benafshe. However, the Rebbe says, we see that this is a taish from the Baal Shem Tov, but when it comes, to learn Pshat in the Mishnah, we cannot follow this Pshat, because the Alter Rebbe does not accept the Girsa with the word Yechidi. The Alter Rebbe accepts the Girsa with the words, he's traveling, and it's no difference whether he's Yechidi or not Yechidi. He's a Mahalach B'derech V'shein. And again, the Rebbe keeps on stressing that we have to keep in mind, if it's something which is learned in Pirkei Avos, it's a milah de chasidus. In other words, something which is not al pi din, a requirement. It's a milah de chasidus. It's an additional requirement which Pirkei Avos requires from us, teaches us. So the question arises: what is this teaching here from Rabbi Yankiv? So Rabbi went on to explain. Rabbi Yankiv was also a tremendous masmid in learning. Maybe not at the level of Reb Shimon, Terasayim Nasai. The Rebbe quoted a medrash that Rabbi Yankiv participated in Reb Shimon's chasana. And Reb Shimon asked him that he should wait for him a short while and they'll go back together or something like it. And Rabbi Yankiv refused, because Rabbi Yankiv said he cannot afford to waste this time. So Rabbi Yankiv is also known for tremendous masmid. So Rabbi Yankiv is telling us, Hamahalach b'derech. He's in the middle of learning, he's going on the way, and he's thinking learning. He's thinking the Torah. But as he's going on the road, he notices the beauty of HaKadosh, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created. Manoah ilon zeh, manoah nir zeh. How beautiful and how gorgeous and outstanding is this tree or this field. Ma'ala olav HaKosuf. The Torah, Kosov, there's no particular pasuk the Rebbe says. However, as Torah looks at it, Torah cannot accept this. What's the pshat? In other words, from the level of Torah, from the level of Kosov, it is, Kosov means Torah, Kosov, Mikro. This is considered Ke'ilu Mischayev Benafshe. In other words, Mitzat Torah, if a Yid is involved, if a person is learning, there is no excuse for him to interrupt into any other side thing. Whatever the side thing may be, even if the side thing may be something so outstanding that he's ready to make a bracha, and recite a bracha, Baruch Shekocha B'Elamai, because he sees the beautiful trees which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created. So Mitzad Milah de Chasidusah of Rabbi Yankiv. Rabbi Yankiv is telling us, Kosov, the level of Torah, if we're talking in a level of Ma'asim Tovim, if we're talking in Mitzat other views, then there's nothing wrong with it. But if we're looking at it from a point of view of Kosov, from a point of view of Torah, Torah claims that there's nothing above Torah. If there's a Yid that's involved in the in-depth learning of Torah, he has no right to be mafsik and say, here's a beautiful tree, here's a beautiful field. However, this is something which we cannot require from everybody. This is something which is milah de chasidusah. That is why it's quoted in Pirkei Avos. However, the Rabbi adds on, from Reb Shimon is known for a real outstanding level of Torah Soim Nasei. From Reb Shimon's point of view, this is no milah de chasidusah. From Reb Shimon's point of view, this is how a person should act. It's not a chassidus, it's not something additional. That's why the saying in this Mishnah cannot be from Reb Shimon. However, Rabbi Yankiv, who is also known for his greatness in learning, But still, it's not such type of a hasmada as the hasmada of Rab Shimon. So Rabbi Yankiv tells us that a person, when he's involved in learning, kosuv, the level of learning, the level of Torah, which this is what kosuv means scripture, Torah. Torah does not appreciate that if he would be mafsik and get involved into other inyanim. This is how the Rebbe teaches this mission. The Rebbe went on, it is extremely appropriate to talk about the greatness of Torah today, because we know that the Gemara tells us that Chamishasa B'Av is a time, let's quote it in Shulchan Aruch, Chamishasa B'Av is a time when everyone is supposed to see to it, to learn, to get involved into additional kviyas and learning and add on new inyanim, new shiurim in Limud Torah. So Mamela, it's extremely appropriate for today's date of Chamishasa B'Av to stress this Mishnah, which this Mishnah as well stresses the greatness of Torah, the greatness of Limud, because here again we see the great importance of Torah. Rabbi also added on that we're taki after Tisha B'Av, and it's Chamishasa B'Av already, but it's the entire month of Av has the mazel of Aryeh, the mazel of lion. And we find in Chazal that the Beis HaMikdash, the Mizbeach, the Beis HaMikdash is also referred to as Ariel, as a lion. The Rebbe said it's extremely appropriate to still go on with learning and doing good deeds for the entire month of Av, because by doing good deeds in the entire month of Av, this will strengthen that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should bring back the Ariel in the month of Mazal Aryeh, in the month of Mazal Aryeh, which is this month of Av. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should again give us the Beis HaMikdash, which is compared to Ariel. The Rebbe also spoke that this week, Wednesday night in Eretz Yisrael, the completion of the first Sefer Torah is taking place. Sefer Torah, which was written for children all over the world, and it's again an Indian of Hakel, which is again, Hakel stands for unity. This is also an idea which unites children from all over the world. It's something which puts together over 304,000 Jewish children who are participating in this Sefer Torah, and this will take place this week, the night to Chaf Av, in other words, Wednesday night in Eretz Yisrael.
Someone said it's Tuesday.
I don't think so. He didn't get involved. The Rebbe didn't say the details. The Rebbe said Oil Chaf Av. I don't know. The Rebbe said that it's an extreme proper time to utilize this week again, that everybody should see wherever possible, in whatever way possible, to utilize this week to reach out to many, many more children and get these Jewish children as participants in the second Sefer Torah, which will be written following the completion of the first Sefer Torah. The Rebbe also mentioned that this week comes out to be Chaf Av, which is the Yortzeit of his father. And again, the Rebbe learned the Zoya with commentary, with Pirushim from his father, and has a special shaykhus to this week, being that Shabbos Meneim is Baruch in Kula Yom, and Shabbos gives bracha to the entire week, and this week particularly is the Yortzeit, is the Baal HaIlula of his father on the 20th day of Av. The Rebbe went on to learn a Rashi in this week's Sedra.
Subject. Question 2. What does the author say about it? D. You've probably had your doubts about the old adage, sugar and spice and everything nice, that's what little girls are made of. Finally, the evidence is in. Girls are no more...
Then the pasuk goes on. Pasuk goes on saying, Abei ta'abdun mahem al haaretz. Chas v'shalom, that the Rebbe will punish Yidden, and he will destroy them in a fast way. Let us look into the Rashi. The Rashi is on Pasuk Chafhei, beginning with the word V'noi Shanta. What will the Rashi briefly? Ramaz lahem. Rashi says this is a remez, this is a hint. She yigmu mimena, that they will be driven out of Eretz Yisrael, l'soif ches meyes v'chamishim mishtayim shana. after being in Eretz Yisrael for a period of 852 years, they will be driven out of Eretz Yisrael. Keminyan v'noishantem. This is the same numeric value if we will take the word v'noishantem and add up how much each letter, every letter has a value in Lashon Kodesh. It'll give us this total of 852. However, Rashi goes on, V'hu hiktim, the Rebishter hastened it, v'higlom, and he drove them out of Eretz Yisrael, l'soif ches meyes v'chamishim, after being in Eretz Yisrael 850 years. V'hiktim shtei shanim le'v'noishantem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu did it 2 years before the v'noishantem. Why? So Rashi says it's the kindness of Hashem. Kedei shelo yiskayim behem ki abeit abeit. Because the pasuk goes on, v'noishantem, you will belong in Eretz Yisrael and you will do the no good in the eyes of Hashem. Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will destroy Chas v'shalom Eden. So in order not to fulfill the latter part of the pasuk, which says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to destroy Eden, the Rebbe set it up in such a way that Yidden shouldn't be in Eretz Yisrael as long as v'noishantem, meaning as long as 852 years, but rather 850 years. And Memela, the Rebbe did not fulfill the latter part of the pasuk as well. He did not destroy the Yidden. And he brings a raya from a pasuk in the Nil. V'zeu shenema, this is what the pasuk tells us in the Nil. Vayishkoit Hashem al hara, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did the bad. He rushed to do the bad. What's the pshat? HaKadosh Baruch Hu rushed to do the bad. Vayiviyah aleinu, when he brought it upon us. So Rashi says, it goes on the pasuk, Ki tzadik Hashem Elokeinu. It's all because the righteousness of Hashem. What's the righteousness of Hashem? Tzedakah os imanu. It is that tzedakah. Why? Shemiher la'aviyah shtei shonim lifnei zmana. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu rushed to destroy us. To get us out of Eretz Yisrael 2 years before the time. Memela HaKadosh Baruch, it's a tzedakah, it's a chesed. So that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu will also not fulfill the latter part, which says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will chas v'shalom destroy you. So Rebbe really took apart this Rashi. It says, first of all, what's this expression, remez lahem? Rashi is not involved in Ramazim. Rashi says pshat, no hints, no remez, no hidden things. Then the Rebbe asked, what is this 852 is the total of v'noishantem? The Rebbe didn't want they should be that long, so the Rebbe should have made it 851 years. So it already wouldn't be the total of v'noishantem, but why get them out a year earlier from Eretz Yisrael? What's symbolic, what's behind the idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu taking Yidden out 2 years before? Could have been a shorter while before. Let us look exactly into the Rashi for a minute. Rashi says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu drove him out of Eretz Yisrael at the end of 850 years. What's the pshat at the end? Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael, we all know, in the month of Nisan. Yidden were driven out of Eretz Yisrael, we all know, in the month of Av. From Nisan to Av is not a year. From Nisan to Av is practically 3 to 4 months. Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, and then is Av. So it's not at the end of 850 years, it's rather in the middle or even at the beginning of the 850 years. In fact, this question the Rebbe didn't answer. But the question arises, what's the pshat at the end of 850 years? The Rebbe went on to explain briefly, we find already in Chumash Bereshis, we find an expression in Rashi, HaMikra hazeh oimer darsheni. This pasuk says, darshan me. In other words, though Rashi's Inyan is always to say pshat at a level of pshutei shel mikra, still there are certain psukim which force Rashi into a situation where Rashi has to go out of the realm of pshat and tell us and interpret the pasuk with some different way. So right away in Bereshis, Rashi uses a lengthy expression, HaMikra hazeh oimer darshen. Same thing it comes to this pasuk. There's no more need for Rashi to say, HaMikra hazeh oimer, say something in a format of remez, because the child who's already gone through, he's already in the 5th Chumash, is used to the way Rashi explains in Yonim. So we understand that just by the word remez lahem, it's sufficient for Rashi to tell the student that here Rashi is going to say pshat in a different way, outside the realm of pshat. The emes is, Rabbi went on, we find, by Moshe Rabbeinu we find, Vayar K'yein Ish, Vayaches HaMitzri. Well, at the beginning of Chumash Moshe, Moshe saw the Mitzri that started up with the Yid. So Moshe looked around. What's the pshat? He looked around. So Rashi says he looked around to see if there would be any Gerim coming out of this person, of this Mitzri. And once he realized, Vayar Ki Ein Ish, he saw there's no descendant out of him that's going to come out and join Klal Yisrael, then he was able to kill him. Vayachas HaMitzri. Mela, we already see that there is an inyan that HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks around, just like Moshe did it. The same thing is Shayach by the Eibishter as well. That the Eibishter could look around beforehand and evaluate the situation and Mela see what to do. When it came that the Yidden were 850 years in Eretz Yisrael, so the question would arise, perhaps the Yidden would do tshuva afterwards. Yidden acted improper after being 850 years in Eretz Yisrael. However, if the Yidden at that time would do tshuva, then the Rebbe wouldn't have to drive him out of Eretz Yisrael. However, just like Moshe Rabbeinu was able to realize what would be coming out of the Mitzri, the same way the Rebbe was able to see what would happen with the Yidden within the next period of time. Remember, if the Rebbe saw within the next period, that within the next 2 years the Yidden unfortunately will not do tshuva, so the Rebbe realized that he has no alternative. He has to get him out of Eretz Yisrael now. Because should he wait 2 more years, then it would be worse. Then he will have to fulfill what says here in the Pasuk, Abei Ta'abdon, to destroy the Yidden, and this he didn't want to do. Memele, it's tzedakah from Hashem that HaKadosh Baruch Hu hastened to get the Yidden out of Eretz Yisrael 2 years early. Why up is 2 years? Why 2? Why not 1? First of all, the Rebbe said Pshat, Alpi Pshat, being that there's an expression in the Pasuk, Abed Ta'abdun. Pasuk doesn't say Ta'abdun, Pasuk, or Abed. Pasuk uses a double expression, how the Yidden would be destroyed after staying Mispav in Oishantem in Eretz Yisrael and not acting properly. So against this expression of Abed Ta'abdun, HaKadosh Baruch Hu took them out 2 years earlier to that. Then the Rebbe said, 1 for each, right? Then the Rebbe said another touch, very geschmack touch. Says this is maybe not in the Derech HaPshat, but a little outside of Derech HaPshat, it may be able to be interpreted this way. Rebbe said there's a klal that if a person buys karka in Eretz Yisrael, al pidin times of indeed in Eretz Yisrael, the halacha was that he had to hold on to the karka, he had to hold on to the property for 2 years. Prior to 2 years, he wasn't allowed to turn it over, he wasn't allowed to sell it. What do we see? That 2 years holding on karka in Eretz Yisrael is symbolic for an inyan of a chazakah of holding on karka in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, when the person possesses karka, land in Eretz Yisrael for 2 years, this is some sort of an authority. This gives him complete ownership when he holds on to it for 2 years. This is what we find. Memela. Here, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu found Yidden, unfortunately, in a situation where HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to take Yidden out of Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because he had to drive him away from Eretz Yisrael, chase him off Eretz Yisrael because Yidden weren't acting properly. That is why HaKadosh Baruch Hu found it befitting, again, to get him away from Eretz Yisrael. It's symbolic to use the idea of 2 years. Why? Because just like 2 years stands for a kinyan in Eretz Yisrael, stands for the idea of showing ownership and possession on land in Eretz Yisrael. Well, one holds on to land for 2 years, the same thing is when it comes the opposite way. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to get the Yidden away from Eretz Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu selected to use this idea of 2 years, and he got him out of Eretz Yisrael 2 years earlier. If, because of the idea that the Yidden shouldn't be destroyed, it didn't have to be 2 years like the Rebbe asked in the Kasha. It could have been a shorter period, as long as they shouldn't live up to the period of V'neshantem. But here the Rebbe wanted to show that the Yidden aren't worthy holding on to Eretz Yisrael. And he had to get them away from Eretz Yisrael, so it was symbolic to use the idea to get them away from Eretz Yisrael in the number of 2 years, because 2 years is a period which shows an Indian of ownership, so shows possession in Eretz Yisrael. So the Rebbe got them out of Eretz Yisrael 850, after being in Eretz Yisrael for 850 years, rather than 852 years, as long as it shouldn't be fulfilled in the Yidden, the idea of Abita Abdun. And this is what Rebbe stressed, V'zehu shenema. And this is an openly in the pasuk of the Nil. Vayishkoid Hashem al hara, vayavia aleinu. Hakadosh Baruch Hu hastened to bring us something which is no good. However, this was done out of Hakadosh Baruch Hu's sitkus. Ki tzadik Hashem aleinu. Because the Rebishter is a tzadik to Yidden, the Rebishter did not want to fulfill Chas v'Shalom to destroy Yidden. That is why the Rebishter took the Yidden out of Eretz Yisrael after being in Eretz Yisrael for a period of 850 years, rather waiting to the 852, rather not waiting actually to 852. They shouldn't live up to the V'nei Shantem, but after being 850 years, the Rebbe took them out of Eretz Yisrael.
Next week.
If there's a Farbrengen next week, or at least beginning from the following week, we will begin at 9:45 Mitzvah Shem. The days are much shorter.
Next week,
Welcome.